Welcome to the channel. Today we're sharing a cheating story you won't believe. If you enjoy it, please like and subscribe. Let's get started. Call me a clueless husband, and I'd agree. Happy, yes, but clueless. Life seemed perfect: 2 kids under 6, a lovable Labrador, a great job, a lovely home, and most importantly, my incredible wife, Sophia. We met 5 years ago, both 25, shortly after she moved to Greenville from Kansas. Our connection was instant. Within a week, she moved in, and 4 months later we were married. Sure, it was quick, but I never imagined someone so amazing would even date me, let alone marry me. She said it was my sense of humor that won her over. I had a solid career as a copywriter at a marketing firm, with a few awards under my belt. On the side, I did stand-up comedy at corporate gigs organized by my company. Sophia was an orphan with no family, not even uncles, aunts, or cousins. She couldn't bear to talk about what it was like growing up in foster homes, and I never pushed her on that subject or anything related to her rough childhood. I was counting my blessings as I wheeled the trash cans from my backyard out to the curb for the next morning's pickup. That's when I ran into my crazy neighbor, Nora, who was always a real pain in the neck. She marched over to me with a sneer on her face, and I steeled myself for her latest rant. Little did I know, I would soon be eternally grateful to Nora, my crazy next-door neighbor. Nora goes through my trash and others on our block, and she yells at us if we don't recycle every single item. Sometimes I just toss it all into the trash can, plastic bottles and all, and she gives me hell for it. She's in her late 70s, and I don't want to yell back and risk giving her a heart attack. I push the trash can to the curb, next to the bin for recyclables, and return to my backyard to bring out the container for yard waste, only to find Nora ready to pounce again. She pointed to the open recycle bin and asked why I was putting used condom wrappers in there instead of in the trash container. She used a stick to poke around and showed me half a dozen wrappers and some used condoms. She argued that the people who sort through the recyclables shouldn't have to deal with my used condoms. I was stunned. I had a vasectomy after our second child was born. Whose condoms were those? This evidence seemed to incriminate my wife. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't figure out how someone would put them in my trash if they hadn't used them in my house. I went to the kitchen and got a plastic bag, and with a stick, I placed the used condoms inside. I wanted to know whose DNA was on them. I promised Nora I would be more careful in the future. I must be the most clueless husband on earth. I hadn't had a clue that my wife was cheating on me. Actually, I still didn't have any proof, but maybe that's only because I hadn't been looking. Looking back, I realized that my wife hadn't initiated intimacy with me for months and just lay there when I tried to be affectionate. I went back inside and tried to casually look around for any clues, but honestly, I had no idea what I was looking for. I checked my wife's nightstand for condoms but found none. That night, after my wife fell asleep, I tried to access her cell phone but discovered it was now locked. It had never been locked before. That was suspicious, but it didn't prove anything. The next day, with heightened awareness, I noticed that my wife never left her phone out of her possession. At dinner, the kids' faces were covered with spaghetti sauce, and I saw my chance. I asked my wife, who was at the sink, to give me her phone so I could photograph the kids' messy faces. She hesitated but finally gave in to my repeated requests. She unlocked the phone but hovered over me as I took some photos. I asked her why her phone was now password protected, and she said it was to keep the kids from playing games on it. I told her that was a good idea, but since I wouldn't be playing games, she should give me the password. She said she would but first had to go to the bathroom. She took her phone, and I assumed she was busy erasing any incriminating evidence. While she was in the bathroom, I went to the fridge to get one of my homebrewed beers. There were 4 inside. There should have been 6. My wife hates beer, so I knew she didn't drink any. Apparently, the man who used the condoms and my wife also drank my beer. The next day, I went to a spy store in town and bought some voice-activated recorders to hide around the house. I also placed a motion-activated camera facing our bed and another facing the living room couch. I didn't put any in the kids' rooms. I couldn't imagine my wife would stoop that low. I sent my DNA and the DNA from the condoms to a nationally recognized DNA database. The test showed that my wife's lover was related to me, but I didn't know his name. That night, as my wife slept, I took her phone and found the file for deleted messages. To my horror, she was having an affair with my cousin Ethan. They met up twice a week in our house. I would deal with that bastard. I also discovered that Sophia was talking about murdering me. They planned to drug me with a date rape drug and then claim that I fell off our small motorboat while we were fishing on the lake and drowned. After that, she and Ethan could live large with my life insurance. Ethan had always been my nemesis. As children, he would always bully me and our other cousins, but my parents claimed they didn't believe me and never made him stop. He used to gloat about that and called me a wimp. He was 3 years older and a lot bigger and tougher than I was. On more than one occasion, he beat me up just for his amusement, and my parents did nothing to stop him. I knew he would beat the crap out of me if I ever tried to fight him fairly. One night, as he had dinner at my house while my parents were in the kitchen, he punched me in the stomach. Without any hesitation, I grabbed my steak knife and chased him around the dining room, threatening to kill him as tears streamed down my face. He wasn't taunting me. He was screaming for my parents to save him. My parents were shocked, took the knife away from me, and made me apologize for scaring Ethan. They didn't believe in self-defense, I guess. My dad worked for his brother-in-law, Ethan's father, and that's why Ethan could do no wrong, and my parents wouldn't stand up for me. The bullying didn't stop until I left for college. Now we're adults and he's still a bully, but I had no need to fight him fairly now. I would fight to win, whatever the cost and whatever I had to do. Not just for him sleeping with my wife, but for a lifetime of bullying me. Payback time would soon arrive, and it would be vicious. Of course, the first thing I did was change the beneficiaries on my life insurance to my children in a trust managed by my best friend and cousin, Lucas. At dinner, my wife talked about a fishing trip with me in the next week or two. I acted agreeable to the idea. I was very careful about what I ate or drank at home after that. 2 days later, I watched the video of them having sex in my bed and mocking me. They delighted in making me a cuckold. Ethan was no better looking than I was. He was more successful, but only because his father owned the business where he and my father worked. He was in a lot worse physical shape, with at least an extra 60 pounds in his stomach, which poured over and hid his belt. I held in my anger. I wasn't going to get even. I was going to destroy him. I decided there was no hope of reconciling with my wife now that I knew she wanted to kill me. The sight of her naked with my archenemy turned all my love into hatred. Once again, he drank my homebrewed beer, claiming it was the best beer in town and that brewing it was all I was good for, to which my wife agreed. I decided that would be his downfall. I would poison him. I arranged for my doctor to give me a prescription for 3 months of Viagra. I threw away the last of the beer and brewed another batch, putting enough Viagra into each bottle to give a racehorse nonstop excitement for a week, or an overweight man a heart attack. It was well over the dangerous level, especially since you shouldn't mix Viagra with alcohol. I placed the rest of the pills in their box on the bathroom counter. That day, I left work early and waited down the street in my car until I heard a siren. As an ambulance raced down my street, I ran to my house. As I opened the door, the paramedics were wheeling a fat, naked man out on a gurney. I ran over, recognized my cousin, and yelled at him, asking why he was naked in my house. He didn't answer. He was alive and breathing with an oxygen mask. "You're going to die, fatso," I taunted him. Was being intimate with my wife worth dying for, you piece of trash? Then I saw my wife, who seemed to be naked under the bathrobe she wore. I didn't say a word to her. I learned that Ethan had his heart attack while, so to speak, in the saddle and collapsed on top of my wife. His weight broke 2 of her ribs. It took her some time to wiggle out from under the fat slob. She thought she would be suffocated and was in shock. After the ambulance left with both Ethan and my wife, I removed and destroyed all the tainted beer bottles but took my package of Viagra from the bathroom counter and placed it in my pocket. That night, wearing rubber gloves, I visited Ethan in his hospital room. He was hooked up to a ventilator. Oxygen flowed through a flexible plastic tube into his mouth. He looked up and saw me. He tried to press the nurse call button, but I took it out of his hand. I put his fingerprints on my box of Viagra. He was now sweating. "Are you scared?" I asked. "Well, you should be." I squeezed the rubber tubing so that the oxygen stopped flowing for a moment. He wheezed, and then I released the tube so he could breathe again. I did it twice more, and he was mouthing the words, "Please don't." I laughed at him and told him that I would return later to finish the job. Then I left his room and went to visit my wife. She was gazing at the ceiling and didn't acknowledge my entrance. I told her how unhappy I was that Ethan hadn't crushed her to death like she deserved. She heard me and started crying. I never returned to the hospital. I went home, placed the Viagra box with his fingerprints on the bathroom counter, and set about finding my children. They were staying with my parents. My parents knew what my wife had been up to with Ethan and had been covering for them. My father still worked for Ethan's father, and that's where his loyalty lay. I went over there and told my parents what really happened. I also said they should have let me kill Ethan when we were children, or at least have stood up for me. Now he was half dead, and I couldn't be happier. I told them to take one last look at their grandchildren because they would never see them again. I phoned Ethan's parents and gloated about how their son nearly died screwing my wife. I think that's his karma, I told them, and mentioned how grateful I was that my father warned me what Ethan was doing at my house. Complete fabrication designed to get my father fired from his job. I guess you never taught Ethan not to take what wasn't his. If he dies, it's your fault. Ethan didn't die, but he would spend the rest of his life towing a large oxygen tank on wheels around with him. It's hard to be a ladies' man when you're an invalid. Not the best revenge, but not the worst either. 3 days later, my father phoned me and asked if it was safe for my wife to return to our house. I told him no. I had already filed for divorce. As a final jab at Ethan, I hired Lucas, another one of our cousins whom Ethan had also mercilessly bullied. Lucas was excited about getting his own revenge on Ethan. In addition to filing for my divorce, Lucas also sued Ethan for intentional infliction of emotional distress on my behalf. Lucas, who was every bit as vengeful as I was, had Ethan served in his hospital room while Ethan's parents were present. Once again, he went into cardiac arrest, but the doctors managed to save him again. This was turning out to be quite amusing. Ethan claimed that he never took the Viagra and had been poisoned. His fingerprints on the package convinced the police that he was lying. In truth, based on the number of pills that should have been in the package, I knew he had indeed taken some of the pills. This was further proven because when he was admitted, the hospital pumped his stomach and found the residue of the pills. My wife caught a virus while in the hospital. Unfortunately, it didn't kill her, but she did suffer through a lot of pain for several weeks. If you're healthy, a hospital is the last place you want to be. It's a petri dish for bacteria, viruses, and a multitude of diseases. With her low immunity, she caught something called Clostridioides difficile, or C. diff. It's highly contagious and highly dangerous. She had to remain in the hospital for another 10 days. Her karma had bitten her in the butt once again. My children didn't understand why their mother didn't return home. When the hospital finally released her, I was at a loss to explain it to them in an age-appropriate manner. I just said she needed a timeout, and that seemed to satisfy them a little. It was a little late in the game, but I hired a private investigator to find some dirt on my wife and her affair with Ethan, though I thought the EMT's report was proof enough of adultery. I read his report just an hour before my first court hearing with Sophia. I was drinking some water, and I did a spit take, getting all the papers in my lawyer's hands wet. I gave him the report and he almost fell off his chair. When my wife took the stand, the bailiff asked for her name. She said she was Mrs. Sophia Anderson. My lawyer objected, which confused the judge. My lawyer said that calling herself Mrs. assumed facts not in evidence. The judge seemed puzzled until my lawyer asked to approach the bench. He handed the judge the file that we had just received. The judge, a young woman no more than 40, leaned back in her chair and laughed as she handed the file to my wife's attorney. She addressed my wife, asking what her birth name was. Sophia responded that her maiden name was Smith. "Were you ever known as Sophia Johnson?" the judge asked. My wife fainted and almost fell off the witness stand, but the bailiff caught her. The judge faced my wife's lawyer. "Do you have copies of the divorce decree between your client and her first husband?" Her lawyer was stunned and asked for a recess so he could consult with his client. The judge instructed the bailiff to handcuff my wife. The judge spoke slowly. "Mrs. Johnson, there is no evidence that you ever divorced your first husband. There is, however, an arrest warrant for you from Montana for murder. You and your husband are accused of robbing a convenience store where witnesses claim you shot and killed the clerk about 5 years ago and then disappeared. By the way, your husband is in prison for committing a felony that led to murder. The state of Montana will be notified that you are in custody, awaiting extradition for murder. I previously thought that learning of my wife's infidelity was the low point of my life. It wasn't. The lowest possible point came that evening when I had to explain to our children that their mother was in jail and would remain there for a long time because she had done some very bad things. I held them as they cried in my arms. I didn't know if I should take them to see their mother before she left for Montana, but they insisted, and I took them. Once again, I was wrong about the lowest point of my life. That point was reached when they saw their mother behind bars in an orange uniform that had the word prisoner stamped on the back. The money I didn't have to spend on alimony, I more than spent on psychologists for my kids and me for the next 3 years. My kids have endured enough turmoil, so I don't date. Among the many surprises that interrupted my life was the discovery that Sophia wasn't an orphan. She had a mother and father who contacted me and asked to visit their grandchildren. They were decent people. They apologized nonstop for the life choices their daughter made. They weren't evil like their daughter. Her father was a car mechanic, and his wife worked as a receptionist. My kids quickly warmed up to them, especially since we were estranged from my parents. They visit us twice a year, and twice a year we visit them. They have a married son with 3 children, so my kids are happy to now have cousins. It's nice to have family again. I'm fortunate that most days I can work from home and literally phone it in, or more precisely, email my work in. My boss was worried that my ads were no longer the award-winning, funny ads I used to write. The company valued my contribution and, in an effort to get me back on track, sent my children and me to Six Flags for a week. Watching my children laugh and have a great time made me realize that this was more therapeutic for all of us than a year of therapy. It was time to start living again. Once again, I can laugh, and with my new advertisements, make the audience for my ads laugh. My latest commercial, which won a prestigious award, was inspired by a letter my children's mother sent to them explaining that she worked on a chain gang picking up litter on Montana highways. My commercial was for a vacation resort in the Rocky Mountains. It begins with a bunch of people in a large office chained to their desks and computers, working while singing Sam Cooke's immortal song Chain Gang. Then they all break free from their chains, and are next seen enjoying freedom at the luxury resort, swimming and playing tennis and golf while singing another song by Sam Cooke. We're having a party. Second story, I met my future second wife at a Renaissance fair about 3 years ago. I was a paid performer, a knight in armor on horseback in the jousting shows. It was great fun for the participants as well as the spectators. I saw a beautiful, blonde-haired woman with a long scarf tied around her neck in the audience next to the field. I pranced my horse over to her and asked, "My lady, will you place your scarf on my lance to show that I am your champion?" She turned red, but as her girlfriends cheered her on, she tied the scarf to my lance. In this joust, it was agreed that I would win and unhorse my opponent. We had reversed roles an hour ago. We charged towards each other, carefully making sure that our balsa wood lances hit only one another's shields. As agreed, my opponent fell off his horse. I raised my lance and trotted my horse over to my fair lady to return her scarf. I asked her to meet me after the show, and she agreed as her girlfriends hooped it up for us. They laughed that we were a knight and his lady. "So, are you my knight in shining armor?" she asked. "I'd love to be," I answered. "I'm Ryan, and you are?" "I'm Olivia," she responded. We walked around the fair together as young children came over to have their photo taken with me since I was still in armor. Olivia liked that I treated each child as special and spoke to each of them for as long as they wanted. "You'll make a good father," Olivia said as she took my hand in hers. "I'm already a father," I responded, and Olivia removed her hand from mine. "I don't date married men," she said as she gave me a hard look. "I'm not married. I'm a widower. My wife died about a year ago while riding her horse in a cross-country race." Olivia quickly apologized and took my hand again. "How old is your child?" "She's a little over 5, I answered, taking out my wallet and showing Olivia a photo of her. "She looks just like you," Olivia noted. "I'll take that as a compliment, but she's not my biological daughter. I adopted her when I married her mother." "Does her biological father have custody?" "No, he disappeared when he got his girlfriend pregnant in high school. I have full custody." We walked over to a space where children were drawing pictures or playing games, babysat by fair employees. My daughter, Emily, ran over to hug me. I lifted her to sit on my shoulders as I instructed her to shake hands with Olivia, which she did with her usual enthusiasm. Olivia loved children. She was a teacher, and I was an emergency medical technician, EMT. I was studying to become a paramedic, which was more complicated and paid better. My parents had died and left me a 5-bedroom house that was too big for just Emily and me, but I loved the house too much to sell it. Olivia soon came to love the house too and often dreamed out loud about filling all the empty bedrooms with our children. A year later, after we agreed to have at least 2 children, we got married. Of course, Emily was my best man. She loved wearing a fancy dress and holding the rings. As a paramedic, my hours fluctuated wildly. Unfortunately, it had a bad effect on my marriage. Sometimes I worked the day shift and sometimes the graveyard shift. All emergency responders and their families face these challenges, and I thought we would get through it. As I rose in seniority, my hours would stabilize but never be 9 to 5 every day. I worked at a hospital close to our home, and sometimes I would run home for a quick lunch or dinner with my family and then race back to work. My old house had 5 bedrooms, and Olivia often spoke of filling each bedroom with our children. She said it so often that it became a mantra. Some days that was all she talked about. After trying unsuccessfully for several years to have a child, we were both examined by doctors and discovered that my boys didn't swim. I was sterile. Olivia was crushed when the doctor gave us the news. She said all the right things to make me feel better, but I knew she didn't mean them. She couldn't hide the look of disappointment on her face. I looked into her eyes and knew she would leave me because of her strong desire, an insatiable craving to have a baby. I didn't get drunk or become self-destructive. I threw myself into my work and my family, but the whole vibe in our house changed. Olivia took some night classes to work on her master's degree and was out of the house several nights a week. There was no longer any warmth in her kisses. I felt like the biggest loser on earth. An idiot with an IQ of 70 could father a child, but I couldn't. A murderer could father children, but I, who had saved countless lives, couldn't. Seems so unfair, but that's how life often is. One night, when Emily was busy with her homework, I sat Olivia down for an important talk. I told her I knew how much she wanted to have a baby and said we should discuss our options. We could adopt, use a sperm donor, and I took her hand and kissed it, we could divorce so she could find a husband who wasn't sterile. Olivia ran out of the room crying. When I tried to bring it up later, she refused to discuss the issue. She withdrew further away, and all physical intimacy stopped. We were living in hell, and I didn't know if there was anything I could do to save my marriage, the way I had saved so many patients in the ambulance over the years. One night at dinner, Emily nonchalantly asked if we were getting a divorce. Before I could answer, Olivia said, "Yes." Later that night, Olivia sat down next to me on our couch while I watched Grey's Anatomy on TV. Despite living that life 7 days a week, Grey's Anatomy was my favorite show. "Ryan," she began, "I love you so much, but I'm obsessed with having a child and being married to the child's father. I have never cheated on you, but I can no longer stay married to you. There's a man at work named David that I'm attracted to, and he's been flirting back with me. We've had dinner a few times and gone dancing. Olivia, if he's flirting with a married woman, then by definition he's a bum. I won't stop a divorce, but David's not someone upon whom you can rely. Ryan, you don't know him. He's kind. He listens to me and understands me." Then she got up, ran to the bathroom and cried. We filed for divorce a few days later. The house was mine, but we split everything else 50-50ths. There was no screaming, name-calling, or bad-mouthing each other to our friends. We never revealed the cause of our breakup. I loved her too much to hurt her, and she didn't want to embarrass me. I wanted her to be happy and fulfilled, and I couldn't provide that. We didn't remain friends, though she moved only a few blocks away. The thought of seeing her with another man brought me too much pain to stay in touch with her. I had been a casual friend with Isabella, an attractive emergency room nurse at my hospital, for years. We never discussed our personal lives with one another, except to show one another photos of our children. We didn't even flirt, but somehow there was a connection between us. When her husband died about a year ago, all the paramedics not on call went to the funeral. On the first Christmas after her husband's death, we all dropped off presents for her children at her house. Isabella cried with happiness that we cared so much for her family. The day after my divorce was final, I brought a heart attack victim to the hospital. Isabella did the intake and commented that he was another patient with a broken heart. The pain I'd felt from the divorce overcame me in a tidal wave. I sat down on a chair and cried my heart out. Isabella sat down next to me and held my hand. I cried on her shoulder, telling her how unfair life had been to me, explaining that my sterility ended my marriage. But worst of all, it took the only mother my daughter, Emily, had ever known out of her life, leaving her shattered, despite being in therapy. Isabella took out her wallet and removed a photo of her family with her husband and their 3 children. As you know, my husband Don died of a heart attack a little over a year ago. My kids and I are just drifting through life without him. This weekend, I planned on taking them to the zoo. I'd love it if you and Emily would join us. Before you fall madly in love with me, I joked. Remember that I'm sterile. Isabella rubbed my back. After my last son was born, I had my tubes tied, so now I'm sterile too. I guess that makes us a perfect couple, she said, rubbing my back. That statement and her touch awakened feelings in my heart that I thought were dead. As I looked down, my body was telling me that the awakened feelings weren't just in my heart but also in a part of my body a little bit lower. Somewhere in my mind, Isabella moved from the column for platonic coworker to the column for potential lover. I couldn't stop myself from smiling, and Isabella smiled back. I've watched how you take care of all your patients as you drop them off, and I've always been impressed. Impressed by your, I guess the word is humanity. I'll be blunt, half of the doctors here have come on to me after my husband died. The other half came on to me before he died. I turned them all down because they lack humility. That's a quality they squeeze out of people in medical school. I'm very attracted to you, and I know you're a great father to your daughter. You're the kind of man I want and need in my life. Let's give this a chance, she said as she leaned over to kiss me. I wasn't just starved for sex. I was starved for love and affection, and this kiss was a wake-up call for what was missing in my life. Yes, I answered. This feels so right. Let's give this a chance. At first, her kids were wary of me, but they remembered the Christmas presents I had dropped off the year before and gave me a chance. I suppose I grew on them with my corny jokes and off-pitch voice when I sang kid songs with them. Emily took to Isabella at once. I think her need and desire for a loving mother was just as great as my need for a loving wife. One of her sons was Emily's age, so they soon became best friends. After Isabella and her family moved into my house, I won't say that the kids never squabbled, but that's what kids do. I couldn't believe that for the third time in my life, I was in love with a wonderful woman who felt the same way about me. We lived together for just a few months before Emily and I got down on our knees together to propose to Isabella, to the delight of Isabella and her kids. We married 2 weeks later. We didn't have the time or money for a luxurious honeymoon, so I borrowed a fire-engine red Mustang convertible from a friend, and we all drove to the beach for the day. We rented and continuously fell off surfboards to the constant laughter of all of us. We did a lot better at making sandcastles with the kids, who then buried my legs in the sand. Despite Isabella constantly applying sunscreen to us all, we returned home as red as the Mustang convertible we borrowed. A few months later, I was called to a supermarket in my neighborhood where a woman had gone into the final stages of labor, leaving no time to transport her to the hospital. The baby was about to come out when I arrived. I wore a mask, and the mother also wore a mask, though that wasn't the part of her on which I concentrated. She was also too distracted to look at me. My partner and I delivered a healthy baby girl. There were no complications, and we transported both to the hospital to be checked out anyway. We'd done this dozens of times, and it was routine. I guess I phoned it in and hadn't paid much attention to the woman because the birth had been so easy and straightforward. As Isabella processed them in, I began sneezing, so I walked 10 feet away. With people catching viruses left and right, I didn't want to infect the mother or her infant if I had been exposed to anything. Several of my coworkers had caught infections despite all our precautions with our patients. When you're a paramedic, the occupational hazards can kill you. That's why we're almost paranoid about avoiding being infected or infecting others. Isabella asked for the contact information for the baby's father, and the new mother cried that her boyfriend ran off when she became pregnant. I was literally married to a knight in shining armor, but I was hellbent on having a child, and my ex-husband was sterile, so I left a great guy for a bum who flirted with me when I was still married, she said through her tears. Even after my husband warned me about him, Isabella asked her if she could reconcile with her former husband. The woman took Isabella's hand. I must admit that I went to his house a few months ago to see if he would give me a second chance. I discovered that he was very happily married to the kind of beautiful wife that he deserves, and they have enough children to fill all the bedrooms in that big old house that I dreamed of filling with my children. Then she paused as tears dropped from her eyes. I'm Olivia. My ex-husband's name is Ryan, but he's no longer my knight in shining armor. He's yours now. Third story. Lately, my wife had seemed distant and despondent. At first, I attributed her mood to empty nest syndrome as our youngest would soon leave for college. But then I suspected something more sinister because of sudden late nights at the office or going out for drinks with the rest of her office staff after work every Friday night. One Friday night, our youngest son had a bad upset stomach. I phoned my wife and asked her to buy some medicine on her way home. She explained that she was at a bar with the rest of the office gang and would buy some before she returned home a few hours later. I asked her to buy it now and return now because our son needed it immediately. She told me that she couldn't leave now and that our son would survive for a few more hours. Leave the damn bar now, buy the medicine, and help me take care of our son. She didn't answer but hung up on me. I was furious. What could be more important than the health of our child? Then I realized that there was no bar noise in the background. That's when I realized she was cheating on me, which was horrible, but putting pleasure with her boyfriend before taking care of a sick child was unforgivable. I didn't care how excited she was. Our first duty had always been to our children. I was 99% sure that Emma was cheating, but I had to be 100% sure before I did anything. I swallowed my pride and remained silent when she eventually returned home 2 hours later. My son was not as forgiving as I was and demanded to know what was so important that she couldn't go to the pharmacy to help him. The next Friday, when she called me explaining that she and the staff were going out for drinks, I told her to have a good time but to remember that I loved her and to not do anything that would jeopardize our marriage. She called me melodramatic. She didn't know that I was parked in my car across from her office when she called me. 2 minutes later, she left the office with your basic tall and handsome gigolo who was 10 years younger than my wife. I immediately recognized him. He was Daniel, our accountant. His office was in the same building as my wife's company. I followed them to a motel and then drove home. This was not the week for me to start World War III with my wife. This was a week to celebrate some major milestones in the lives of our children, and I wouldn't do anything to spoil it for them. 2 years ago, when we interviewed Daniel to be our accountant, he indicated that he was willing to help us cheat on our taxes. I not only declined but later told my wife that I only wanted an honest accountant, not one on his way to jail. Emma was insistent and we hired Daniel. Now, of course, I understood why she was so eager to hire him. I believed that if he was willing to steal for us, he wouldn't mind stealing from us. If he was willing to mess with the IRS when they could put him in prison, why would he treat us better since there was little I could do to him? It was a whirlwind week for my wife, Emma, and me. Our youngest son graduated from high school, our middle son graduated from college, and our oldest son had just graduated from law school. It was time to start the next phase in my life without taking care of children every day. I was excited and exhausted from all the ceremonies this weekend and sat back on my reclining chair in the living room of the house we'd raised our family in for 25 years. I had a profound sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. I had arranged my work life to always have breakfast with my family and dinner at least 80% of the time. The downside to this was that I didn't earn as much money as the guys who worked until 9 p.m. every night and half the time didn't even remember the names of their children. Emma brought in 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to me. "Take a drink," she suggested, or maybe ordered. "I have something important to tell you. I've fallen in love with someone else, and I want a trial separation from you to decide what to do." I didn't miss a beat. "Well then, feel free to move out as soon as you want." I sipped the champagne. "I don't want to move out. I want you to," she replied. "I'm not going anywhere. If you want to screw someone else, you won't do it in my house while we're married." I then handed my wife divorce papers. "After you sign these papers and I file for divorce, you can screw everyone you want whenever you want." The shocked look on her face made my whole day. "I don't want a divorce," Emma quickly blurted out as she drummed her fingertips on her cell phone, which rested on the table next to the champagne glass. "And I don't want to be married to a woman who's in love with and intimate with someone else." "How long have you been intimate with your lover?" She couldn't look me in the eye and slowly whispered, 6 months. "So you want a divorce so you can marry him?" I asked. "I don't know. That's why I want a separation. I need to find myself." "Who's the lucky guy who swept you off your feet?" I inquired even though I knew. I wanted to see if she would be honest with me. Emma didn't answer. "Come on, fess up. Who is he?" "You don't need to know," she answered. I grabbed her cell phone. I discovered that she was recording our conversation. I pushed a few buttons and told Emma that I emailed the voice file to her parents, our 3 children, and a bunch of her other contacts. "Now you won't have to face anyone to tell them that you want to be I've been a good wife and mother all these years. How could you embarrass me like that?" she cried. "If you're ashamed of what you said, you shouldn't have said it." Then I looked at her recent calls and messages. Every entry had a full name, but one was just listed by initials, MK. Daniel James was our family accountant. I hit redial, and Daniel answered the phone, saying, "Hello, Sweetheart, have you told your idiot husband yet? Emma hid her face in her hands. Daniel, this is Alex, Emma's husband. If I ever hear of you so much as speaking to my wife, I'll taser you. Then, when you're on the ground, I'll smash your balls with my steel-toe boots. Do you understand? Yes, he stammered. I want you to tell Emma that it's over between you and her, or I'm coming after you. I'll get a restraining order against you, Alex, he screamed. That's okay. They'll glue it to your tombstone, I said softly and hung up. I turned to my wife. You'd better hurry to be intimate with your boyfriend's Johnson while he still has it. Emma ran out of the room crying and calling me an animal. She was right. I remembered the first time I had champagne with my wife. It was our first date. Most girls expect to be taken to an expensive restaurant on a first date. I didn't feel that way. I tried to be more imaginative than that. I took Emma to a local family-owned delicatessen. I had arranged with the owner to reserve a table. It was set up with an expensive tablecloth and candelabra on the table, along with 3 bottles of expensive wine. Emma thought it was a great idea, and the evening went well for both of us. In case you're curious, pastrami goes well with Dom Perignon champagne or a Chardonnay, while Cabernet Sauvignon complements a corned beef sandwich with a side of potato salad. After my wife of 25 years dropped her bombshell, I sat back in my recliner and tried to figure out where it all went wrong. I was set on getting revenge on my wife and her lover. I knew how to hurt my wife without getting arrested. I phoned a bunch of credit card companies and canceled all her cards. Then I went online and moved all the money from our joint savings and checking accounts to my children's college trust account. I own a small but profitable real estate company. We manage a few small office buildings and a small strip mall. I have 3 full-time employees, one of whom is my sister. In a divorce, my wife would get half of the business, but only if there was still a business to divide. That was only the beginning of my revenge. I still had some codeine cough medicine from a bad cold I had last year. I made my wife a smoothie before she began her 40-minute drive to work, but this time I placed a lot of codeine in the smoothie. It would need about 20 minutes to take effect. I got in my car and followed her. I waited until she began weaving in and out of traffic, and I phoned 911 to report a drunk driver. I followed for another 5 minutes until she was pulled over. At the officer's demand, she exited the car and fell on her face, barely able to stand. She was arrested and taken to jail, where a drug and alcohol test showed she had a great deal of codeine in her system. She phoned me, but I didn't answer. She left a voicemail begging me to bail her out of jail. I didn't respond. 3 months later, after she served her 30-day sentence for driving under the influence, her lover, her attorney, and I, along with my attorney, stood in front of a judge who ended our marriage. My wife got the house and half of my business instead of alimony. I got my car, took on the loan on her car, and had to pay her mortgage. Both the car, the house, and their loans were now in her name. 2 months later, a viral outbreak brought the business world to a halt, including all my clients, and I closed my business. I went on unemployment. My wife's lawyer dragged me back into court. I had the receipts for my unemployment checks. The judge yelled at me for closing my business, but I explained that I hadn't shut it down. The outbreak had, by putting my clients out of business. I stopped making the payments on her Mercedes. The monthly payments were more than my unemployment checks. I explained to the judge, you can forget the mortgage payments on her extravagantly expensive house. I didn't have anywhere near the money to make those payments. I wasn't done yet with Emma, but I had to wait until after my divorce was final. Then I arranged an appointment at an IRS office and explained that Daniel offered to help us cheat on our taxes, and I had refused. I also explained that my wife ran off with him, and I really wanted to hurt him, but I wasn't lying about his offer to help us cheat. With the divorce final, I restarted my business now that the virus had ended, or at least subsided. I wasn't earning as much as before, but since I no longer supported a luxury-loving lover, it was more than enough for me. The IRS not only conducted an audit, but served Emma with search warrants for her house, office, and cars. They found $200,000 in cash in the trunk of the Chevy in her garage. She had stolen all that money from her various clients. She was indicted for fraud, grand larceny, and tax evasion. Emma had one surprise for the IRS. She had religiously paid all the taxes due on the money she stole. The IRS dropped the charge of tax evasion, but she was found guilty of a slew of other charges and sentenced to 10 years in prison. You never want to mess with the IRS or a jealous husband. Thank you all for watching. What part of today's story resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting content.